It's going to be a multi-topic video today, mostly because I don't think I have enough to say about any one of these things. But in general, I'm going to be talking about the umbrella of durability, specifically regarding health, i.e. hit points, and recovery methods. So, hit points, they feel so intuitive, don't they? You have an amount of damage that you can take, and when you run out of that allowance, you go down. It feels pretty rudimentary, and I think this is probably it for sure has its roots in D&D's wargaming history, where individual units, you don't really need a system more complicated than that. For individual models in a war game, they have like 1 health or 2 health or whatever they have, and you do damage to them. When they run out of health, they're gone. You don't need a more complicated system. And a lot of, not all, but a lot of like miniature war games still use a very comparable system to this day. When it comes to RPGs, though, the modern sensibility is that is extremely rudimentary to the point that it misses out on storytelling opportunities. Because in real life, you wouldn't expect, I shouldn't say in real life, I just did a video on realism. In stories and in the narrative that we have in our heads, we don't expect people to be at full effectiveness until suddenly unconscious. There's a grade in between there. And this is when a lot of people who are working on their first RPG tend to design death spirals, because you expect that as you become injured, you become less effective. That's not great design for other reasons, even if it reflects reality to an extent. So there's a lot of other systems for tracking a character's health out there. I personally find hit points are fine for the most part. You want a couple of allowances in there for a few specific things. One, dying words. That's a big one. So you want to be quite clear that when you run out of hit points, you are defeated. You are not necessarily dead or even unconscious. You are defeated. That is, you are no longer able to really put up a fight. And I think that there should be a point between full health and no health that is marked in some significant way. Now, I don't think that there should necessarily be any penalties for being past that point, but having a specific built-in marker, 4th edition called it bloodied, that suggests that like you are in a more critical zone than you were before. I think that's helpful, not only for building mechanics that have to do with you get stronger as you get injured, like a barbarian might, but also just for narrative purposes, remembering that it evokes this sense of the tension is building, you're getting low, and that's fun. Now, you can do that without a explicit marker, but it gives the game something to latch onto mechanically to create opportunities for characters, actions or bonuses that you can only get when you're on one side or the other, or when your target of your attacks is on one side or the other of that mark. So that, I think, is a useful mechanic. And I think it's a shame that 5th edition did away with that. But also, you have to remember that hit points cannot reasonably represent your ability to sustain physical trauma. That can't be what they are. No one survives an axe to the face. It just doesn't happen. If you get feathered with 3 or 4 arrows, it doesn't matter how much damage they've done, you are not really going to be continuing much longer once the adrenaline comes down. These kinds of things. So the hit points cannot represent just physical trauma. They have to be, as Legend of the Five Rings calls it, like a fatigue. basically, it's a fatigue stat that you spend to avoid taking the physical trauma. And that's kind of what that middle point marker can be there to represent. Is like, once you've gone past that point, you've taken actual physical injury. Before that, you're just dodging. Maybe scratches and bruises here and there, but nothing significant. These are near misses. You are expending your hit points to not die. Once you run out of hit points, you can no longer spend hit points to not die, and then you start dying. And in Legend of the Five Rings does it with, like, once you run out of trauma, now you start taking critical hits, and critical hits are the real injuries. And that's when you start, like, losing body parts, bleeding out, that kind of thing. And, of course, dying. So, D&D, I think, doesn't need to go all the way in that direction. I think it wouldn't necessarily be healthy for the kind of heroic fantasy that D&D at least purports to facilitate. Because that's a lot more encouraging people to not get into combat because it's very deadly. Critical hits are, they can take you down. So I think rather than a mechanical change, I think there should just be an ideological change. This sort of growing an awareness should be spread that hit points are not your capacity to absorb physical trauma. They are your ability to avoid physical trauma. And only when you run out of them do you actually start taking real hits. And so healing spells really just restore your sort of inner vitality more than actually closing up wounds. And I think it would actually be helpful to the narrative if there was some sort of distinction between running out of hit points and taking actual damage, like, for lack of a better word, actual harm, like bodily injury. And I've seen a few, this is mainly back in 3rd edition, I've seen a few sort of house rule mechanics for incorporating this, and none of them really work out that well because the system isn't built around it. And you really have to build the system around these kinds of mechanics in order for them to work really well. You can't just patch them in. And I'm not suggesting that D&D necessarily should, it just would be nice if they did. So hit points are simple. They're lacking in a lot of depth, I think, mechanically, for a health system, but they're fine for what they are. Now, here's the issue as it pertains to 5th edition D&D. Now, because I haven't really gone off on 5th edition in at least an hour, so I have to here. The difference in hit points between classes is pretty minuscule. Because the only difference is, like, because they're all based on your hit dice, you know. Fighters have D10s, monks have D8s, wizards have D6s, etc. And so your hit points at first level are that die maxed, and your hit points every level after that are that die halved, rounded up. Plus Constitution. Now, I think adding your Constitution modifier at every level, I'm torn on whether or not that's even a good idea. Because on the one hand, you don't nearly have enough hit points if you don't do it. But also, it dilutes the importance of your class's hit dice. The number of hit points that you actually get, which is already not that much. Like, the difference between the highest and the lowest is not that much. Because every step up you go on the dice is only 1 per level, 2 at first level. So from a D6 to a D8, you have 2 extra hit points at first level, 1 extra hit point for every level after that. And at D10, which is, remember, that's a fighter versus a wizard, that is 4 hit points at level 1, 2 hit points for every level after that. That's not that big of a difference. When you consider how easy it is for wizards to get armor proficiencies, they have defensive spells that can make them nigh invincible. The difference in hit points is pretty tiny. And so that is an issue. That is an issue that 5th edition has introduced and is never going to go away in this edition. You would need a whole 6th edition to change that, because that's how like core it is to the way that classes are designed. I've seen a lot of, it's very, very popular amongst my circles for homebrew versions of martial classes, particularly those that are meant to go into melee, to just straight double the amount of hit points that you get. So it'd be like 2d8s, 2d10s, etc. I don't really like that. It is mechanically unsatisfying. It just seems, or not unsatisfying. It's inelegant, I think. I don't like the way that looks on paper. So when I did my barbarian, I just said, starting from 2nd level onward, anytime you get hit points from leveling up in this class, just get twice as many hit points as normal. And I think that works out. That looks a lot better on paper. I mean, mechanically, it's very similar. It's extremely similar. And I don't, and we're never ever going to see that happen in any kind of an official class, because people will be like, oh, that's a crazy amount of hit points. It's a lot of hit points. But when you think about the importance of not taking damage when it comes to high difficulty campaigns, the importance of not taking damage is so extreme that the difference between ranged and melee characters there's a massive gulf between them. Melee characters are going to be taking a bunch more damage than ranged characters, often for no additional benefit. Ranged is already one of the best fighting styles, just because of the archery fighting style. You want to stay far away. You're going to actually end up doing more damage than a melee character. You have the same defenses as a melee character. You have the same hit points as a melee character. There's no benefit to being in melee. And so that's an issue that hit points could potentially fix. If you have a melee-oriented class or subclass, you could use hit points as a balancing axis to make that a more viable playstyle. They're not going to, because Wizards of the Coast either doesn't see the problem or doesn't care about the problem. Probably both, if I had to guess. Because at this stage, the problem is not costing them any money. It's not costing them any sales. So why spend the effort to fix it? That is what it is. I'm getting grossly off topic here. I have gone from talking about health systems to the melee ranged gap, and then bagging on WotC for their philosophies. Yeah, I tend to travel on these things, especially when I'm not really focused in on one specific aspect. But you're along for the journey with me, and I appreciate that. Oh, no, I'm out of dew. I'm out of Mountain Dew. All right. So, we've talked about health as a system. We've talked about the differences between high health and low health characters and how it's really not that much. And it for sure does not make up for the defensive abilities that casters tend to get. That cleric is walking around in basically the same armor that a fighter is, but they also have AC buffing spells that aren't good enough for them to cast. That kind of level. And then wizards, it's so easy. My preference for buffing up wizards, a little aside here, I think if you're playing a wizard and you have any desire to optimize, if you have any desire to be effective and efficient, you want medium armor. My preferred method of getting it is to dip one level into cleric. I have a lot of different arguments for why that is good. And then you basically have the same AC as the fighter, but you also have shield, and you also have silvery barbs, and you also have control effects that keep the enemy away from you. You have Misty Step if you get caught up in melee and you just don't want to be there anymore. Bye, gone. I'm rambling again. But anyways, hit points. There's there's one more thing I want to talk about with hit points, and that is hit points as a resource. And this is kind of a two-pronged thing. One, some homebrew, and I'm including Blood Hunter in this as homebrew, though it is often considered official, try to use hit points as a resource. You spend hit points for additional effect. That is basically never going to work out. It's either going to be one side or the other in terms of like either way too much benefit for way too little cost or way too much cost for way too little benefit. Either way, it's going to be bad design. It's going to be bad because the whole point of most characters' kits is to not take damage. You're trying not to take damage because hit points are the only resource that matters in the end. If you can get to the end of the adventuring day and you have hit points left, you're winning. That's it. It doesn't matter if you have spell slots left. It matters if you have hit points left. They're the most important resource. And that's what they are. They are a resource. Here's the second prong. They are a resource that must sometimes be spent over the course of a day. You try not to spend them. You try to do what you can to avoid them, but sometimes taking damage is better than expending the resource that would prevent you from taking damage. There's no sense spending a whole spell slot if you're only going to take 3 or 4 points of damage. Like, why stop that? And here's and that really does come down to the thing. Like, every class has resources. There's no such thing as a resourceless class. Fighters, rogues, barbarians, monks also have key. The fighter, rogues, and barbarians are often regarded as resourceless. They're not. They have hit points. Hit points are a resource. They're a resource that casters also have, and casters have very nearly as many hit points as the marshals do, on top of having spell slots. So that's the really frustrating thing that people do online in arguments about about game balance. About game balance in general. It doesn't really matter what specific topic they're talking about. They'll say that, the marshals are going to be more consistent over the course of the adventuring day, whereas the casters are going to be stronger earlier in the day, and then they run out of spell slots and they get weaker. Well, the marshals don't have spell slots to run out of. They start the day out of spell slots, if you think about it that way. Everyone starts with hit points. And the hit points are the resource that matters. And marshals lose them faster because they don't have spell slots or any other resource. It doesn't have to be spell slots. They don't have any resources that they can spend to save on their hit points. And hit points are the only resource that matters. So in order to avoid going a lot longer on this, I'm going to cut off the discussion there. And I will leave you with this. Imagine a world where everyone has other resources, be it powers that can be expended, spell slots, mana, whatever it may be. Maybe it's different for every class. Everyone has resources on top of your health, which kind of always has to be the most important resource. In a world where that is true, the marshals could have a more efficient resource, a more easily recoverable resource. And so then you could have a world where, spell slots are a bigger cost. You're going to have to tone down spells regardless. You have to tone down spells. I was thinking about it today. Real quick aside, man, I'm distracted today. I had a thought today that in a rewrite of 5th edition, I would tone down spells such that what are currently 5th level spells are 9th level spells. That's about how powerful they should ever get. Stretch the spells out so that at 17th level or whatever you end up doing, at 17th level where you're getting 9th level spells now, you would get 5th level spells. That's the extent. So, spellcasters have those, and the martial characters have other resources, other abilities, other powers that they can use to protect their hit points. And because that's mainly what you spend resources to do, is protect your hit points. Whether you are killing the enemy so that they can't hurt you, you're controlling the enemy so they can't hurt you, you are, or you are actively, like, directly saying, like, oh, I'm going to protect my ally now, defensive abilities. All of those are just to save hit points. That's what the whole point is. That's how you win in an encounter. That's how you get to the end of the adventuring day, is by conserving your hit points. And marshals don't have any way to do that. And that is ultimately the problem with them. So the tiny amount of extra hit points that they have don't compare to being able to protect their entire health bar.